Hi and welcome. Short notice before we get started. This video is part of a comprehensive GitHub Actions course that I have available on Udemy. The link with the big discount is in the description of this video. And if you don't want to miss any upcoming videos or courses that I publish, make sure to subscribe to the channel and follow the videos. In previous lectures, we discussed that there are other ways for us to execute logic in GitHub workflows that do not include running shell scripts. And these are basically the actions that we mean here. Now, once again, don't get confused. GitHub Actions here I see as the name of the whole solution offered by GitHub. And actions here we're going to talk about now, how we can use different actions within our workflow. So to clear up and explain what these actions are, let's go over a simple example. We have an npm package workflow here, which executes on push, and it has a single job. If you look at the steps here, we have a few steps that we are familiar with. We are already familiar with the run command, but if we look at the first step here, and if you look here, it uses a certain action. Now, if it is prefixed by actions /, this is an official action released and managed by GitHub Actions, but here it could actually have something else, right? It doesn't need to always be prefixed with actions. It can be prefixed with something else. For example, AWS has a set of actions that we can use in GitHub Actions, so this would not start with actions. Bottom line here is that actions is not a necessary, is not a mandatory keyword. This simply identifies the version of the action that we are using here. Now, what is this doing? Well, behind the scenes, this action is going to set up node with the specified node version here in our current job. There are several commands which are executed by this action behind the scenes. We could actually have them executed step by step via run commands in our shell, but there is no need for us to repeat ourselves and specify all the run commands to set up node, because this is a very common task. Therefore, it is encapsulated, it is published separately as an action by GitHub, and we can just leverage it and use it in our workflow. So we are abstracting all the steps necessary to set up node with a version 20 by simply using this action here. Let's go through some of the reasons why we would want to use actions instead of shell scripts. The first one is that we can avoid repetitive and extensive commands. So it prevents code duplication, and it also reduces the chances of mistakes. If we were to set up node in 20 different workflows, for example, and we have 10 commands to do that, then we have 200 commands that we need to keep track of, and if there is anything we need to change, we need to go to all these 20 workflows and we need to change that. If we have an action here, then we can simply update the action, publish a new version, and this will be reflected in all the workflows that use that action. The second element is that we can configure this action via the with key value pair. So it enables great flexibility and reusability. If we want to set up another node version, we can use the same action here, and we can simply pass a different identifier here. As you can imagine, this can become very powerful, and it can enable us to develop very flexible and very reusable actions that our teams, our organization, or ourselves, we can use in different repositories to achieve roughly the same task, but with different configuration. Another important or another very useful aspect of actions is that they can be combined with other steps, right? So you can see here, this is the first action or the first step in a series of steps in our job. So we can use actions to encapsulate setup tasks, for example, or to encapsulate some cleanup tasks. Maybe we want to upload logs to a certain destination and clean up some of the things in our runners, and we can encapsulate that in its own action and then use that either before or after running other commands. And finally, we can create our own actions for public or for private use. So we are not restricted only to the actions available at the marketplace. In a few minutes, we're going to have a look at the marketplace, but here we can basically create any type of custom code that we want, and we can publish it as an action for either internal use or for public use. We have an entire section towards the end of the course about creating our own actions and the different ways we can go about it. So we're going to discuss this in details towards the end of the course, but just keep in mind that we can always wrap up some of the commands that we execute regularly, that we execute repetitively. We can wrap them up in our own action and make it available and reuse that. I have mentioned the marketplace on the slides, and if you just come here to github.com/marketplace, right, so we can start like this. And this is going to take us to a slightly different page, but here on the left side, you can see that we have both apps and actions. GitHub apps are something else. So let's click here on actions, and we will see that we have, well, basically 20,000 plus results here in the actions marketplace. Now, you can see that we have some badges here, creator verified by GitHub. This is very important, right? We don't want to execute actions that are not trusted or that we don't know where they come from. And this creator verified here is a very useful badge to have, right? Doesn't mean that it doesn't go all the way to ensuring that the action is fully trustworthy. But if the action you are looking here does not have this badge, then I would be very careful about it. I would go into the code and really do an audit there to see if there is nothing malicious. So anyway, so here we have a couple of actions already for us. These are all by actions, and these actions here is from GitHub Actions. So we can trust these actions here. And you can see there are a few setup Java, setup Node.js, setup Go. So here, if we scroll down a little bit, yeah, there's the Go. And we have also caching, uploading and downloading, build artifacts. We're going to discuss these actions in details later on in the course. And you can find a lot of different actions here and also from different providers. For example, this is from Datadog, right? This is created by Datadog and made available by Datadog. And if we were to, for example, look for AWS here, we would also find several actions that are provided, maintained, published by AWS Actions. Now, this one, configure AWS credentials, is very useful one because it allows us to basically authenticate into AWS as long as we have the setup done in the AWS side, and this retrieves for us a short-lived token, authentication token, that allows us to do some operations on AWS based on the role that we specify. But anyway, we are going too much into detail, so let's just go back. Our point here is not to discuss this action in details, but before we wrap up the lecture, I just want to show you something. I'm going to type here Terraform. Okay, you could type anything, and I'm just using this as an example. Terraform is an infrastructure as code tool. And just as a comment, I'm also working on a Terraform course, which is to be published soon. So depending on when you are watching this course here, this lecture, the course might already be available. Make sure to check that out. So my point here is that let's have a look at this page, right? So we see here that there are many different actions. And what I want to highlight is that some of them do not have this badge. So first of all, Terraform compliance does not have the badge. Terraform linters does not have the badge. Now, it doesn't mean that these actions are untrusted or are malicious by default, right? But if I look here at the stars, and they are not really pointing towards a lot of reliability, or at least the actions are not widely used in many different CI/CD or GitHub Actions workflows. So I just wanted to show you that you can somehow do a little bit of auditing already at this page. If you click here and open the page of this action, then you can have a look at the GitHub profile via the links here, or the GitHub repository, sorry, via the links here. Click here and we go to the GitHub repository, then you will be able to audit the code. Right here we have a very simple repository. There is just an install shell script and a run shell script, and then you would be able to open this and then go through the code to see if there is anything malicious happening. So this is one way that we can audit, that we can have a look at the different actions, so that we can rest assured that these actions are not doing anything bad with our workflows. Now, this is not guaranteed that the code will stay the same, right? So this can the authors can publish a new version, which means that you would either pin the version that you're using here to make sure that you are using a code you judge to be secure, or you would audit this code on a regular basis to make sure that there is nothing weird happening. If we go back to our GitHub marketplace, I just want to show here that there are a series of Terraform actions that are provided by HashiCorp already, which is the company that owns Terraform in a way. So this creator is verified by GitHub. And if you look here, the setup Terraform is actually widely used. There are many stars here. And basically the stars are not a reflection of how many times this is used, but they are a reflection of, I like to see that as a reflection of how popular and how dynamic, how well maintained the GitHub repository is. So feel free to browse this page. There are many actions and you can actually get a little bit of an understanding of which kind of tasks are normally abstracted behind actions in GitHub Actions. That's it for this lecture. Let's take a short break and come back in the practical exercise where we're going to try to use different actions in our GitHub workflows. Welcome, and let's now go through our practical exercise to understand how we can use actions in our GitHub workflows. Let's start by creating a new file here. We're going to call this 04-usingactions.yaml. And as always, let's give it a name. It's going to be 04 using actions. And let's trigger this to begin with on push. We're going to have a single job. So let's specify the jobs keyword. This is just going to be build. And here we would like to run on Ubuntu latest. And here we would like to do a little bit of work with a React application that doesn't exist yet. Don't worry, we're gonna spin it up soon. And don't worry, you don't need to know anything about React. And if there are any doubts, don't hesitate to use the question section. But here we're gonna keep things simple. The focus is not React. What we want to do is we want to install the dependencies of our application. So I'm just gonna write this as comments here of our React application. And the second thing we would like to do is we would like to execute automated tests. Okay, so it's a very common workflow here, very common sequence of steps. We want to install the dependencies, then we want to run automated tests. And if these are successful, we would like to, for example, build and publish the application. Now, we need to have a React application, right? And how we're going to do that, we're going to simply create a new folder here at the root level. This is going to be called 04 using actions, just so that we know that this relates to our workflow here. And let's change into this directory 04 using actions. And here we're going to use the create React app utility. So you need to have Node and npx or npm installed in your machine. The version that I'm using here is version 20. If you do not have it installed, I do have a video earlier in the course where I go through the steps to set up Node and npm. So if you go through that, then you should be able to have Node installed and you should be able to also use npx. So we want to use the create React app utility here, and I like to use the TypeScript template. It's my own personal preference here. I prefer to use TypeScript whenever possible. And we're gonna just create this inside of the React app folder. Let's do it like this. And once we do that, then it will need to install this package. We need to type yes here. Now this package is not going to be installed globally, but it does need to be installed behind the scenes so that we can set up, we can use the package without having to run a global install. I always prefer to use npx instead of installing it globally and then calling it via the command line. This is again personal preference, but there are few advantages to that. Once we run this, we need to wait a few seconds, perhaps minutes, so that all the dependencies here are installed. At the end, we're going to see a screen saying that everything is installed here, and we can test if everything is working properly. Perfect. So if everything was successful, we will see here a success message at in our console, and we will also see a couple of useful comments. Just to make sure that everything is working, let's change into our React app. And if you look here on the side, we already see the files. Let's not get confused, right? So we are still within the React app folder. It's a little bit tricky from Visual Studio Code. Sometimes this gets hidden. If you have provided here in our npx command, if you have provided this section here, React app, then it's going to create the React application inside of this folder. If you do not provide this, then it's going to create in the existing folder as long as it's empty, right? So here we are inside of React app. So now let's change into React app and let's run the npm run start command. This should start our React application and we should be able to access it on the browser. After a few seconds, we have the address that we need to access here to visualize our application. And if we just open this address here on the browser, then we should be able to see that there is a minimal React application running. So if you see this screen or something similar, right? So this already means that you have set up your React application and you're good to go with our GitHub workflow section of this lecture. Perfect. So back here in our IDE, we can stop the application. We don't need to have it running. Let's just clear this and go back here, as well as to the root directory. You can see that node modules is excluded here. This is from our very first setup lecture where we added the node modules to the git ignore. This is intended because we don't want to commit this, just a small comment, right? Now we would like to proceed with implementing these two steps here that we have written as comments. However, there are a few things that we need to do beforehand, right? So the first thing that we need to do is we need to check out the code from the repository. So even though the workflow is defined inside of the repository, the code of the repository is not available by default to the workflow. So the workflow does not download, does not check out the code from this repository, even though it is stored inside the repository. And this is very simple. It's because you might have a workflow that has nothing to do with the repository, but workflows, remember, workflows have to be defined inside repository. So the first one is we need to check out the code from the repository. And this is going to be our first step. So first step here is going to be called checkout code. And this is going to use an action. And this action is called actions/checkout. And the version here is going to be version 4. It's recommended that you also use version 4 so that we are on the same page here. But if there is a version 5 or later version by the time you're watching this course, I'm going to make sure that everything we discussed here is compatible with later versions. And if it is not, then I'm going to provide some updated lectures as well. So the first thing we need to do is we need to check out the repository. Once we do that, let's start by simply printing the directory structure, right? So printing folders. And here we just want to run ls, like so. Let's see what's the output of this in GitHub Actions. For that, we need to add all our files, including the files here under our 04 using actions React app directory. And we can then commit here with whatever message you see fit. Once we commit that, this will be a few more files than our previous commits, but we can then safely push this to our remote repository. And this is probably because I restarted my computer. So let's just make sure to add this identity here, .ssh/Udemy profile. And now we should be good to go to push. Once we do that, let's come to the actions tab here in our repository, the first version here or the first run. And then if we click on build and we print the folders here, then you will see that now we have the folders available at our working directory. Okay, so this is because we are checking out the code. And you can see here that there are quite a few things that are done by this action for us, so we don't need to worry about anything. The interesting part here is fetching the repository, and this is just executing git fetch. So you can have a look at each of these log groups, and you can see what this action is actually doing. So there are a few things, and if we were to replicate that, it would be quite a few lines of code. Interesting for us is that we have now the files available, so we can actually run our commands inside of this folder. We can remove this, and we can now here, before we run our installation script, we can set up our node environment. The setup node step is going to use as well actions/setup node, and the version that we will use at this point in time is version 3. And here we can pass, as we saw in the example on the slides, we can pass a node version. So this is going to be node version, and here we'll simply take the latest version from the 20th major release, right? So whatever latest minor version is available, this is going to be used to set up Node.js. Let's now install the dependencies. This is going to be called install dependencies. And here I'm gonna commit this with a common mistake that we do, and it is just to simply run npm CI, right? So our first tendency would be, okay, let's just run npm CI. Let's add this. I know that this will throw an error. So let's commit this and let's see what happens on GitHub Actions. Once we do that, let's just push the changes and go back to GitHub Actions. Here in our page, clicking on Actions and then on our 04 using actions. We already have it here. And let's have a look at what happens on our script. So it's now setting up Node. You see that it's taking the Node version 20.9 and the NPM version 10.1, and here you see that there is an error in installing the dependencies, and basically this is saying, hey, it can only install the dependencies if there is an existing package lock.json or an npm shrinkwrap.json, right? So here it's trying to run this npm install or this npm clean install command, but the problem is that we are running this in the root directory. And if we look here in our code, the root directory does not have any package log file, and it's not where our React application is actually living, because our React application is living inside of 04 using actions / React app. So if we click here, this is where our package log file is present. We need to change that in our code here, and for that there is a very useful command. There's a very useful key here that we can use. It's called working directory, and the working directory we can simply provide here 04 using actions / React app. Now this is going to execute all the commands, or basically this run command here. This is going to execute this run command inside of this working directory, right? So instead of doing something like this, which would be valid if we were to do something like this, cd 04 using actions React app and then npm CI. This is also valid, but here it's more clear what we are doing and where we need to run this command if we use the working directory key. And a bit later in this lecture, we're going to see a nicer way why this key is useful for us. So let's change this here. Let's add our changes, or let's commit our changes, and let's push them to GitHub to see the working version of this installation script. In our Actions tab, if we click here, then we should see that this is going to execute successfully. It will probably take a few seconds or minutes, but I think here it's going to be in the realm of seconds to install the dependencies. But if we refresh this, we should see that the script is already running here for 18 seconds, and there are already some logs, which means it's executing correctly. Perfect. Now all the steps have completed. You see here that it took roughly 30 seconds to install the dependencies, and we have a successful workflow run. Back in our workflow file, we can then, after we install the dependencies, run some automated tests. I'm opening here the React app folder, and within package.json file, if you are not familiar with NPM projects, we can find here under the script section. This defines all the scripts that we can run run by prefixing them with npm run and then the name of the script, right? So npm run start is a valid script, npm run build, npm run test, and npm run eject. So here we're going to come to our workflow file and we're going to add a new step. It's going to be called name run unit tests, and we want to run here simply npm run test. Right, so this has the same problem as the previous step, that we need to provide the working directory. Otherwise, this is going to run in the home, let's say, quote unquote, directory of our virtual machine. So we need to provide the working directory here as well. Now, this is a little bit of a repetition, and we probably want to extract this to somewhere else. And we can do that by using a very nice keyword here called defaults in our job definition. So this keyword defaults here is at the job definition level, meaning it's sibling to runs on and to the steps. And then within here, the defaults, we can say run. And then within run, we can give our working directory, right? So now what's going to happen here is whenever we execute this run command in any step, it's going to default to having this working directory as well. So now we can remove this from here and remove this from here. This is a very useful way for us to define some configuration that should be shared between different steps in our same job. And we don't want to include that as either part of the shell script that we are running here or individually in the configuration of each of the steps. If we were to change this working directory to something else, then this would apply to all the steps that are executed in this job. Perfect. So I believe this is already our working configuration. Let's save this and then let's add everything, commit, and push this to the remote repository. After we push that inside of our Actions tab, we should have our new run, and let's have a look at the output of this run. After a few seconds, we'll see that all the steps have completed successfully. And we can see here install dependencies, the run with npm CI, as well as the unit tests here. And this simply executes the npm run test inside of our React app directory. And then this has a single test here if you're interested and not familiar with the structure of a default React app, then you can just have a look inside of the source folder. There's an app.test.tsx, and it basically checks whether this React application, this default React application, has the text learn React. So that's it for our exercise regarding using actions. Once again, this is our first encounter with actions here used inside of workflows. Don't worry about it. We're going to use them over and over again in later lectures. But the focus here was to understand how we can then include this out-of-the-box functionality so that we can make a workflow that is shorter, more concise, and doesn't repeat unnecessary code, right? So our focus here was on the checkout action, which is important if we want to use the code of our repository, and the setup node action, which is important to set up node with a specific version. Remember that Node is available by default in Ubuntu latest. It is available, it's version 18 at the time of this recording, but here we can then fix a certain version so that we don't run into any compatibility issues, right? So here I'm just to clean up, I will remove these comments and let's change the push to workflow dispatch as always so that we don't trigger any unnecessary runs. Let's commit our code and then push this to the remote repository. And with that, we reach the end of this practical exercise. Let's take a short break and come back in the next lecture.